Data Storytellers, longtime recurring guest on the show, the one and only Ylan Kazi. And today we are going to take the opportunity to think through this moment in this whole enterprise AI shift. There's a lot of noise out there in the news cycle about what's happening, why it's happening, what might happen next. And, we definitely don't have any kind of exclusive secret knowledge or access to that, but we are kind of plugged into what's happening, especially on the front line of enterprises today, and it might help us to get closer to the truth. So without further ado, Ylan, welcome back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Laz. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. So what we are going to talk about today, so there's a lot of, again, noise out there, and people are trying to figure out what might happen with AI. Okay, so AI is kind of dominating or has been dominating the news cycle for like 2 years now. It's the big trend of our age, or it seems so. And now a lot of people are talking about, are we in an AI bubble? Was this overhyped? What will be the effect in the economy if it actually bursts and all that? So what I would like to do is, instead of just jumping in and kind of jumping the gun and trying to guess actually what might happen next, I would like to just turn back the clock and look at this whole thing from your perspective, because you were actually someone in the beginning who might have been perceived as an AI skeptic, right, when this whole hype started to grow. And I would like to understand that from your perspective as an enterprise data and now AI leader, how have you processed this whole AI narrative? So if we just look at your role, right, you're Chief Data Officer at Blue Cross Blue Shield, North Dakota. When did AI become a significant narrative thread for you guys? And then maybe we can just kind of look at what happened before 2022, 2023, when ChatGPT revolutionized everything. Obviously, it wasn't ChatGPT, but for the average person, it's ChatGPT marks the point. So, how did this whole AI conversation evolve from your perspective as a professional in your company?
Yeah, I mean, I started just over 3 years ago, so I think it was already being talked about, kind of in like broad brushstrokes and specific use cases that would really kind of help out our members and our stakeholders that we serve. But I think, like you said, once ChatGPT came out, that was really that light bulb moment. And it wasn't even so much the functionality itself, it was the way that anyone with an internet connection could access it. I really think that was the key differentiator at the time. If I rewind further back, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, there was a lot more focus on how do you operationalize machine learning. And there was no real easy way of explaining that to stakeholders. And they couldn't just, pick up their phone or their computer and, start prompting it, right? Very different capabilities. And so at the time, there was still that excitement of, hey, if we apply machine learning or AI to something, will it make it better? And I think that's where my initial skepticism started, because I knew what it would take to actually operationalize it, test it, go through the entire end-to-end process. And it's so much more than, pressing a button, right? A lot of people think, well, you just press a few buttons here, or it's automated, it's good to go. I think that skepticism has, it's helped me going forward. I think what's ironic, though, is I'm actually more excited about LLMs, the ChatGPTs of the world, generative AI, in some cases even more so than I was for traditional machine learning or traditional AI. So I feel like there's just such a promise going forward, and we've really tapped maybe a fraction of that.
Okay, so even before we go further, because we have listeners who are enterprise AI practitioners, people with a lot of technical knowledge or business savvy, but also we have listeners who maybe even today kind of struggle to see the distinction between quote unquote traditional AI. I mean, how traditional can you get when it comes to something like artificial intelligence? But what we coin or what we call traditional AI and generative AI, LLM. So how would you How would you articulate that in a simple way that might make us see the difference?
Yeah, I think with traditional AI, and once again, that's a pretty broad term. There is very key differences between what somebody would consider artificial intelligence versus data science versus machine learning. So I don't want to gloss over the very real differences, but there is a good degree of overlap as well. So when you're working with something like machine learning, for instance, you really have two different types of problems. You have classification problems and you have regression problems. At the end of the day, though, what you're doing is you're utilizing data, you're training an algorithm on it, and then that algorithm is basically predicting future cases of what that could look like. That's essentially, if you really, really had to boil it down. With LLMs, if you really want to boil it down as simply as possible, all the LLM is doing is taking all of the training data, all of the text data that it has, and it's outputting an answer using probability. So it is quite literally predicting the next word based on probability and then just continuing to do that. And what I found is that as you explain it very simply to people like that, the very first question is, well, why is this even useful? Like, how can that be useful if it's just using probability? And I think that's almost where some of the magic is using an LLM, because even though it is probabilistic, it can still be extremely useful. And I think as it continues to move forward and as there are new techniques and better training data, I really see it becoming more at par with human level expertise and even eventually surpassing it. And I think depending on who you talk to, depending on the use cases, and in some cases it already has, in other cases it still has a ways to catch up. But I have just been very impressed by how quickly it has been moving. And the other thing that I found is that a lot of its capabilities are really kind of based on the user. So, we all know those people that have picked up ChatGPT or another LLM. They've typed in prompts here or there, and then they kind of get frustrated with it because it's not outputting what it is that they were actually looking for. And prompting in general it's a very specific skill set. And the more clear that you are in the prompt, the more complete you are, the more that you provide that context, the outcomes that you want to get to, the persona that you wanted to play, you'll get much more contextual answers. And so I think there's an element of, if you're struggling utilizing LLMs, that's a way to kind of brush up on the way that you integrate with them. I think the other piece is being able to utilize it both in a professional and a personal capacity. I think a lot of people, when they first started, it was more in a personal capacity. But there is, really huge untapped areas professionally that I think are very untapped for just a variety of different reasons.
And I love to dig into those, definitely. And maybe for that, just as context of why is this such a prominent conversation today? Because let's say in 2022 and 2023, there weren't too many skeptics with any kind of specific objections, right? Because it was almost like too early for that. All they saw is that, wow, something suddenly passed the Turing test, even if they don't know what the Turing test is. Suddenly something definitely feels like a human, sounds like a human, almost smells like a human when you interact with it. And it was mind-blowing for everyone. It's almost like you remember the first time that you typed something into ChatGPT, and it was just kind of mind-blowing. And then I think a lot of people started to immediately project that, wow, now, over a weekend I can write a whole blog, and wow, okay, copywriters are done. And then when we saw the first videos, or at least the rate at which AI video was progressing, is like, filmmakers are done. Like, everyone's done because now AI is going to take over. So I think the skeptics at that point, their main argument was, is this good for us as humanity, right? It was more like a moral objection, I would say. And by the way, it might or might not be valid. It's not even the point, but that was more like an ethical slash moral stance, right? I think that though, now after 2-3 years, I think the skeptic position matured a little bit, and if we look at the past, let's say 2-3 years of AI, the position that often skeptics present and again, it might be valid. I'm just kind of, I'm just observing the conversation as well, is that in fact, despite all the attention and all the hype and all the money that has gone into AI, it does not have a lot to show for it. Again, we can dissect it and we can look at this case. What is the substance there and what is the projection potentially? But the argument is that even OpenAI today, and we can probably have a conversation split between the consumer applications and then enterprise applications as well, that it's almost like, they are still not driving revenue. They are losing a bunch of money. Perceivably, often they seem to be becoming more desperate. Like, for example, now trying to introduce things like, erotica and all that stuff, which a lot of people are, judging and are put off by it. But then they say that, well, despite all of this, there's still no specific use cases. The MIT study just showed that 95% of enterprise generative AI use cases actually don't produce ROI. Then that was actually, I think, a better study recently by Atlassian, which showed similar numbers, 96%. And obviously, when we go into the methodology of these studies, we can pick it apart. But maybe we can start here. Like, what would be your argument, maybe to counteract this position, or maybe to clarify or dispel some myths that are right now infused into the conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I think to your second point, so the MIT study, and I wrote about this pretty extensively in my newsletter because reading through it, it's a lot less of a technology problem and it's more around a culture problem or skill sets or the way that organizations work. And that's consistently what I found, not only with LLMs and generative AI, but just AI in general. When there are failures or where it doesn't go all the way from idea to implementation, it is very rarely a technology problem or a capability problem. And I think that's just very important to remember. I think the other part of the study is really looking at proof of concepts. And I think we all know, especially in a company environment, that that a good portion of your proof of concepts, that is exactly what they're for. They're not meant to go to the finish line. You're meant to do something quickly, learn from it, and either incorporate it into something else or iterate upon it. So it's not like if you have 100 POCs and only 5 make it to completion, that's a failure either. Like there's a very intentional way of moving forward with them. I think when it comes to companies like OpenAI and some of these others, what I've noticed, and it's not just central to AI companies, but I think even in the past, if you look in history at any type of disruptive or exponential technology, many of the companies that start off with it, they're burning through money, right? And that's kind of the nature of creating many of these technologies. You can have an amazing technology, but it can also be very hard to run as a business. And I think that more of that starts to come later. Where I see this as, less of a flash in the pan and more of it needs to mature is you also have more established companies picking up on it. The Googles of the world, Microsofts, many others. If this was, truly something that didn't really have a promise, I really don't think they would have picked up on any of the investment or even the direction of their product lines and their service lines. And so that's another area that I see. But I do think eventually, you can't just you have to have a profitable product. And I think with any of the LLMs right now, I do think that they're very criminally underpriced. Like I am amazed that you can have, with ChatGPT, for instance, that it's only $20 for a pro plan. I could get, more value in that in the next hour using it versus, you give me a month with that every month. I am getting way more value with that. And I could probably quantify it too. So I think even just the economics of how it works, it's also being formed, along with the advances in the technology. And, we may be sitting here a year or two from now, the economics could look vastly different because the market is still trying to mature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And actually with this, I always like to look at these issues through different lenses, right? So there's in this case, a technology lens, which just has to do with, okay, what are LLMs? How do they work? What are the limitations? What are the potentials in that technology? The specific blockers and so forth. So there's a technology conversation. Then there is a business slash economy conversation. How does this whole thing attract capital? How will that behave? From a business perspective, how can organizations make that lucrative and implement it into their workflows and use it to enhance their existing business processes, or maybe open up new product lines and new service lines, and also and so forth. And I think there's a third conversation which has to do with culture and more like sociology as well, that how is that received by the population, by people in general, and how is that integrated into culture and everyday life, right? And then from this constellation of factors, you have what emerges as the actual trajectory of that technology. Now, with the pricing, I was also surprised that they are so underpriced, but also at the same time, I imagine that they want people to kind of get hooked on it without, again, not passing judgment on whether that's good or not. Is just that from a business strategy perspective, right? First of all, we want to give it to people so that the people themselves will come up with the use cases, right? How people end up using these technologies will tell us a lot. Probably ChatGPT, with, I don't know, how many users does ChatGPT have today? It must be in tens of millions, right?
It's hundreds of millions, if not, it's close to 1 billion probably at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I imagine that ChatGPT or OpenAI monitors those kinds of interactions, even just the types and the shapes of those interactions, and then drives huge value from seeing where users take this technology. That's one. The other is that people will get used to working with it. And then when inevitably you will get to a point where you will be, forced to raise the price of it, well, people will now have a harder time giving it up, right? So that's how I can kind of see the business case in it. Because even if I look at myself, I thought that I would be using ChatGPT for a bunch of things, and I actually ended up not using it for, let's say, writing, right? So writing was one of the obvious cases. Now I can write all these things that I wanted to write before, and I thought that I would be churning out all these, AI written articles, but for some reason, it just did not really happen that way. I also think that there's a case to be made against that, not just because it will make you a lousy writer, but I think now with all the AI slop just flooding the ether, there's a genuine need for actual human articulation. And you can definitely use GPT for other use cases, even with writing, including ideation or exploring and researching and all that stuff, right? How I'm using, for example, ChatGPT is that when I'm on the go or if I'm walking, it's the best way for me to capture ideas when I can actually give a context-rich prompt via voice note, and then I can actually ideate and then create something that I can then return back to when I'm sitting in front of my computer, right? So I think there's definitely this element of getting people hooked, and then they will be able to raise the price. Now, when it comes to the price of it, and maybe this is another objection that we can explore, is that the energy conversation around it, that it's actually incredibly expensive. So the skeptics might say that, okay, well, and we can return to the use case conversation for sure, but then skeptics might say that even if there are tons of use cases, well, it eats up so much energy that it's not viable. And you know what? I don't want my utility bill to go up because someone wants to prompt 24/7. So what would be your response to that kind of objection?
The energy one has been very interesting because even early on with ChatGPT and the other LLMs, that wasn't really on the radar. And then as it started to really gain critical mass, as it started to have a much higher growth rate of users, it did start to creep into everybody's consciousness. And I think where it was really first seen, very tangibly, is that people's electricity bills are going up in certain cases, at least partially because of it. Right now, is it directly because of increased usage? Well, not directly, but these power companies have been having to make infrastructure improvements, and then part of those costs are passed to the consumer. So I think even there, that is also another economics question, because power companies never had to deal with company growth rates like this in the past. I think that's probably a very important short-term consideration. I think the other aspect, though, is it's also revealing just the underinvestment in different types of energy sources, in particular in the US. And I think what can get lost in all of the conversations around renewable energy is the whole question of nuclear. So in an ideal world, I think the vision would be every one of these data centers and anything that requires just a high degree of continuous power usage, you put a small nuclear energy reactor right next to it. But if you try to do that today in the US, it is near impossible to get through the regulatory process. And part of that is probably thinking in times past. Everybody, if you talk about nuclear disasters, you think about Chernobyl or you think about 3 Mile Island. But those were a completely different generation. Now you're into basically generation 3 nuclear energy, almost into generation 4, where it's exponentially safer. It is a lot less risky. And I don't think that message has been shared very broadly. I think a lot of people's heads are still kind of stuck in the past on that. And then I would say, kind of lastly, when we look at societies and how they function and prosperity, there is a direct correlative link between the amount of energy usage and the standard of living.
Hmm.
And so, if this were the ideal world, as we have more energy usage, that creates more and more efficient ways of creating that energy, the sources that are behind it, of the entire economic model within it. But I think where we're at currently is, there is pressure from different stakeholders around the regulatory environment and even just around the pace that energy production can really keep up with it. So it's really not that there's a lack of it. It's more of that is it really being allocated efficiently and effectively?
Mm-hmm. So it actually might end up applying that pressure, and we might end up actually with more energy efficiency as a society as a consequence. We don't know, right? But at least it opens up the conversation. Interesting.
Right. I think too. I think too. There's also a nuance to even just the entire energy industry, and there are a lot of concepts. I'm not an expert by any means, but kind of diving in where I have, from an AI side, it's understanding that energy usage fluctuates, right, a lot during the day, during the night, and it's a lot more complex than people think. It's not like you just create energy and you have a surplus so you can meet demand. It's constantly changing, and I think that also factors into the overall efficiency of those energy sources. So when you look at solar, when you look at wind, it is not as efficient as obviously fossil fuels or even nuclear. And so in more of an ideal world, you do have to have some level of combination between that, because you need to have you need to constantly be meeting that demand that is there. Otherwise, you have to look for ways to curtail it.
Absolutely. So yeah, I know that the energy conversation is an important one. If we kind of circle back to the skeptics who say that on the one hand, there are actually the whole thing that's what they say, that it progresses slower than expected. And actually during this, it's been around for 7 years now. Let's say it's been really in the public consciousness for 3, and all this money and attention went into it. It's just moving too slow, right? So how would you respond to that when someone would say that, look, it should be way further down the evolution now?
Yeah, I would start by saying that we overestimate the amount of progress that we can do in a year, and we vastly underestimate the amount of progress that we can have in 5 years. And I think with whether it's generative AI or even more traditional AI, you have all of these discoveries and innovations under the surface, but it does take time for them to hit critical mass. I think what's different with AI just in general, though, is you start seeing more of an exponential growth curve. So it's not like, every year you double its capabilities. Some years you may quadruple, right, quintuple, or even more. And what's being kind of, lost in many of those discussions is that over time, when you have an exponential growth curve, you wake up one day and you start to realize, how did we even get this far? Like, nobody in their right mind would have predicted it. And I do think we have a little bit of that with these AI agents. I think that has been one area where, even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I don't think anybody could have really envisioned the pace that these AI agents are moving forward and how they're going to be used in vastly different areas, different companies, and even just more broadly in society. But that is an area where I really see that exponential innovation as we go forward. I also think, like any other discovery or invention when it comes to AI, that also brings up additional societal questions that we'll have to, not only ask but try and answer as well.
So if we think about agents, I think I might be wrong about this, but the first time we even started to hear about agents, it might have been this year, like beginning of this year, right? When the average business leader might have heard about agentic AI, right? And it's been less than a year. And where is this whole agentic AI conversation right now? And this is actually something that I think you might have to be close to the technology, building data and AI products within organizations to actually understand. It might be beyond. I mean, if I probably told my wife agentic AI, she probably wouldn't know what I'm talking about, right? I would need to clarify. But can you give your take and view on how this whole agentic conversation is developing within enterprises?
Sure. I think the conversation is definitely maturing. I think at first there was this excitement that, well, agents can do almost anything, and all you have to do is insert them in different processes or different systems, and it's going to make everyone's life easier. Obviously, there's a lot more to that. It does take time to create these agents, to test them. And then I think even kind of like the underlying challenges that you have in many organizations is you may have for example, a process that is documented, but it may not be correct. And the challenge is that if you just kind of put in an agent there and you think you know how it goes, it's not going to work out very well. And so I think it's revealing that in some cases, the existing process may not actually be documented appropriately, but in other cases, there is no process. And so a lot of that initial work is on how do you document it? How do you understand it? So that when you do apply an AI agent to it or multiple agents to it, you're minimizing, any chances of failure. And so I think now that is starting to be more understood. I think the other area that agentic AI is bringing up is that the real value isn't in just kind of slotting agents in certain steps in a process. The real value is actually completely rethinking and redesigning what that process is and making it AI native. That's really the gold standard. But if you're in a company and you're trying to propose this, you're going to get a lot of pushback against it. Because you're going to be changing so many things at once. And so, for some processes where you do have the support and you do have the authority to do it, great. But in many cases, a lot of it is really influencing and showing people how can it be different and how can you make it, more efficient and more effective.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say that when we hear about AI, especially the potential impact of AI, one of the big arguments is that, well, the whole idea of getting rid of people is not a positive narrative to begin with, right? So this also plays into why AI has been progressing slower as it should have because of that pushback, not just about the processes, but people just don't like the idea of AI replacing people. And what I'm seeing and what I'm sensing that even organizations kind of changed their tunes around this, right? And now it's more about, well, let's make people better and let's make people's work easier, and then let the people work on what they actually want to work on, not like the menial task. So from your perspective, how is that conversation developing and evolving? And do you see this as an actual blocker, or is this also changing from your perspective? Do you think that AI will wipe out, hundreds of millions of jobs, and then, people will be out of work, or how do you see that?
Yeah, it's really tough to answer because I've seen kind of both sides of the coin when it comes to this, just broader within the market. So there is an element of, when you do utilize, let's say, generative AI, there is a really big benefit in having that human in the loop, because that way you're able to balance, using automation with somebody's subject matter expertise. Now, obviously, as these algorithms get more complex, or as the LLMs kind of continue with their innovation, you'll probably need less and less of that generally. And so that one person could probably do the work of 5 people. Maybe next year it's 10 people, right? Because they have all these tools available at their disposal. So I think that's one trend where you're going to see, those top 10% of performers are really going to accrue much of the gains, similarly to how we see in, I'll use Hollywood as the example. Most actors make pretty close to the median income in the US. It's only those, maybe 1% or 0.1% of actors that are pulling down tens of millions of dollars a year. So it's a very top heavy, market when it comes to who is really getting millions of dollars. I think other industries, they're not going to follow the Hollywood model where you're going to have a few people making tens of millions of dollars. But I think what you're going to see is that those higher performers are just going to be able to do more generally, and they're going to be able to do it more effectively. So that is definitely a trend. What that does from like a career pathing or career progression, and I think you are starting to see a little bit of that now, is you're probably not going to need as many entry level folks. But I think the danger to that, though, is if you don't have any, how are you creating that pipeline? So what happens 10 years from now if you haven't created the pipeline and you have most of your senior level folks, your experts starting to retire? If you haven't done anything around that, you could almost go backwards or be at a standstill when it comes to expertise, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to execution. So I think that's one component of it. I do think as well, though, that as in particular, as these Gen AI capabilities and the Agentic AI capabilities mature, it's going to be shockingly surprising on areas where you aren't going to need as many people, or where it even moves quicker than we think. And it's a tough message. I think also at the same time, within the headlines that you see, you'll have companies that are saying that this has led to larger layoffs. And I don't really read into that too much, because we'll never know why those companies made those decisions. So it's very easy to say, well, it was because of AI. It could have been for 20 other reasons. But I do think we're going to have an increasing impact around it. And so if you let's say you fast forward 10 years from now, the societal impact of a much higher unemployment rate leads to instability. I mean, you see that in countries that have a very large youth population that have higher rates of unemployment. So you can actually see use cases today of what that looks like. If we think we're moving more in that direction, there is going to have to be a thought process of, okay, what do those individuals do within society? And then I think if you take that even one step further, it really hits all of us at some point. It is my role to focus on X, Y, and Z, or do I even need to start thinking about my career differently in what that looks like? Maybe it becomes less about what I personally can do or what my team can do, and it is more about potentially orchestrating tens of thousands of AI agents, for instance. And it definitely sounds fanciful, but I think it causes each of us to really kind of self-assess and think about how do we find meaning in the world, and how do our roles continue to evolve, and how are we adapting to meet those changes?
Yes, and it's also interesting that today, if you look at the market, actually where the shortages are the brick and mortar jobs. Someone who can build a house, someone who can fix my plumbing, someone who can actually do things with their hands. Right now, the market reality is that there's a huge shortage of that. And then if we look at some of these more intellectual tech jobs, that's the case. There actually seems to be not as clear cut anymore, right? And there's obviously turbulence here because of these new technologies. Some of the technical roles are getting wiped out, especially if we think about data technology and some of those roles that AI can more easily replace. But how do you see that moving forward? Again, I'm just maybe asking you as a person, not even necessarily as a data leader, but how do you see like society changing around this? On the one hand, people who can work with AI will be more valuable than ever if we look at that trajectory of AI actually will take over more and more workflows, and people who can work with that, people who can build that, coordinate that, orchestrate that. But then at the same time, what happens with all these real life roles that we will still need? I mean, we will still be flesh and bone, and we will still need roof over our heads, and we will still need clean water. And then the interface of this kind of AI technology with the real world, it's much more tenuous, right? So if we think about robotics as well, robotics, if we just went with what we thought would be possible, let's say 30 years ago, we're still not there yet. There are a bunch of impressive things. We see the Boston Dynamics videos. We've been seeing them for, a decade in our social feed. But at the same time, I think there's a legitimate case there that when it comes to the real world, there are still no self-driving cars on every single road, mainly, which we thought it might happen. And sure, it might even be the data shows that it's safer, but there is an adoption lag. And when you kind of take these systems out of context and you present them novelty, which is inherent in the real world, it usually still doesn't work out as we think it would. So my point is that I think we're still far off from just robots building houses and fixing the kitchen sink, right? So how do you see society forming around that in the next 5 to 10 years?
There's something about just having things that are tangible versus those things that are intangible. And I think with the intangibles, we're talking about everything that is digital, internet related, something you do on a computer, a phone, etc. And I think you're right. Like, I think early on, even 10, 15 years ago, there was this whole kind of movement around people thinking, well, the first automation, it is going to be the trades, or it is going to be, physical labor. And wow, those people could not have been more dead wrong, I think, in what you're seeing. I think there was also, even more recently, within the last 5 or so years, a lot of support for teaching people how to code. And that was an area, even at the time, I was very skeptical about it, with how quickly coding languages can change, how quickly that can evolve, where it's not even so much about learning how to code, it's knowing the principles behind it. That is probably the most important thing, because then it doesn't matter what language you're coding in, you understand the principles behind it. So I think what that's done is it's created an imbalance in the supply and demand of roles. And so it's really just the market adjusting to those imbalances, right? Where, maybe too many people actually did learn how to do it. And now you're seeing a shortage with plumbers, with electricians, with many of the trades. I think that's a huge opportunity for people. That's an area where, at least now you can kind of almost like punch your own ticket. So I do think there needs to be balance, but I also think at the same time that no one is going to be immune from change. And even though like robotics and applying them to, physical life is a lot more challenging, we are already seeing some of those advancements in it. But then there's like the culture aspect as well. It's very easy for me to go on my phone and start using ChatGPT. The bigger question is, do I want a robot in my house? Do I want a robot? I mean, even if the robot can help me out, do I want this thing watching me? Like, it just it's going to feel very weird. And so I think that with robotics in general, they're going to have to get past like kind of the cultural weirdness of it at first. And I'm sure, eventually they're going to be in everybody's house. We know that that's probably going to happen. But it's that initial phase of it feels weird until it's in kind of the human consciousness, and until a critical mass of people have them. And then I think there's also like that generational component as well. Like the younger generations, it's just going to be normal. They will have, grown up with robots in their house. It's not going to be so different. But, for people like you and I that are at the cusp of it, we're going to be able to see, what was it like pre-robot and what is it like post-robot?
This is a fascinating conversation because you see, I think this is where we encounter something new. And because we can always look back, oh, well, before cars, people were, sticking with their horses and they did not want a car. But then now we have cars and everyone's used to it. And that is true, right? But now, even when I'm seeing, so there's something about anthropomorphizing things, there's something about humanoid technology that we haven't seen unfold before, okay? Because when we see something that's humanoid, that acts like a human, that talks like a human, it is impressive. And we are impressed by it, right? But then when it comes to that permeating the human domain, it actually surprised me. Let me give you an example. AI-generated content. When I first saw it, I was just impressed. If I saw an AI-generated post somewhere that was obviously AI-generated, I didn't care at all. It was like, wow, this is really cool. This is informative. This is fantastic, right? And then now I'm seeing that now that the content on the internet is 50% AI-generated already, there's a massive disengagement from social media. I can see that in my life, and I can see that in other people's lives, and the data shows that too. And these are not people who say that, oh, okay, well, I am on principle don't like AI-generated content, right? So now I'm going to vote with my time and attention. And I'm going to disengage from social media because of that, right? But something happens where genuine human-generated content has some sort of distinctions beyond its appearance. And we don't know exactly what that is. I just read a really good post. It was shared by the director of the AI venture ecosystems at the CTO's office at Microsoft, Taylor Black, who I'm actually going to have a podcast with, I think just next week or the week after. And that was this comic strip from an artist, and it kind of inspected of the whole question of AI-generated art. And it made the case that in the case of AI-generated art, there's the appearance of it, which can look like a human thing. But once you find out that a piece of art was generated by AI, there's a certain kind of deflation that happens when you find out that there's no human being with a story and struggles and skills behind creating it. And I think there's something to it. And this is just when we're talking about the digital space, which is inherently not even a tangible space for us. It's already artificial, but even in the artificial space, when something does not have that human hallmark on it, we do respond to it. And it doesn't matter where you stand, what's your view or moral judgment on AI is. And it might be just a market question, as you said. It might be supply and demand. It might be that something with unlimited supply will inevitably go down in demand and in value. It's just the market. It might be that. At the same time, and I'll let you comment, but if we look at the humanoid robots, so sure, there's a weirdness about it, and it might be that, oh, well, you just need to get used to it. But I think we can't maybe automatically just assume that's going to happen because we haven't seen that before. We haven't seen a humanoid technology that is shaped like a human, acts like a human, should actually substitute a human in that way, appear in our everyday lives. And not even talking about the security concerns. If I did have a humanoid robot, like a 150, 200 pound machine in my home with human functionality on the surface, with a digital interface, potentially connected to the internet, because I have a hard time seeing how those things wouldn't be connected to the internet. That's my house, that's my family, and I have this weapon in my home that I don't necessarily have full control over. I cannot be sure that I will have full control over, right? So I'm just thinking that there are so many things that we can't consider until we get there. We can have the only barrier between us having humanoid robots and the robot butler is that the technology is not capable just yet. But all these psychological factors that we cannot really anticipate makes it an even less predictable trajectory. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there is I think when you're talking about AI AI slop, I guess is the term that everybody uses now. There was just this inherent disgust when you see it. And
Yep.
it's so difficult to describe too, because if I take a step back and truly think about it rationally, and I'll use LinkedIn. I post a lot on LinkedIn. As soon as I see a LinkedIn post that I know is, AI generated, you see a bunch of the emojis, everything's perfect, whatever. I have that disgust. And it's not because, so the post itself could be 100% accurate, 100% truthful. It could even be teaching me something. I think as humans, we just generally have that disgust because there is this thought process that we are all unique in some form or fashion. I really think it gets back to that. I also think too, it questions us, or it really makes us all question, what does it mean to truly be human? It used to mean writing a book. It used to mean painting a painting. But now you can have an LLM do that. You can have it generate any of that content. And so I think it's also useful to see like the flip side of it, right? Like it really makes me think of this movie, the movie I, Robot, with Will Smith.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's interrogating the robot, right? And he asks the robot, he's like, can you paint a painting? Can you create a symphony? And the robot pauses and then it asks him, it says, can you?
Can you? Yeah.
And so I thought that was very interesting because yes, humans can do that. I can't create a symphony. I'm not good at that. But there is an element of, just the very act of creation. And I think the appreciation of excellence just in humanity. I think that's what is really kind of coming out with all of this. And, I think if you do, like I've seen analyses on pop songs over the last 5 or so years, they actually are starting to converge on just a very small subset of similar rhythms, similar beats, and all of these things. It's very fascinating seeing that. You're seeing a lot more of that convergence. And so what I think that does, whether it's, human convergence or even LLMs creating more of this content, whatever that may be, that creates a huge opportunity to actually have, kind of that true human interaction or that true human creation. Like it's not outside the realm of possibility to think that in the next few years, an amazing artist, an amazing songwriter, painter, whoever, is going to basically say, at the end of their book, I didn't use ChatGPT. None of this was LLM generated. It was a completely human effort. And that's going to be seen as a differentiator. I also think too that there are going to be, when we think about like brand experiences, I think this is a huge opportunity for like bespoke or like one-of-one brand experiences where only you can get that experience and nobody else in the world will get that. That is a huge opportunity. If you're looking to start a business today, that might not be a bad idea because I think that's really going to be kind of a growth area. So I think a huge part of this is it really just makes us question maybe many of the assumptions that we had. And it kind of takes us on the edge and can really be uncomfortable in certain ways. But I think that's where, I've really seen like even just thinking about what do I want to do, right? What kind of makes me human? Where should I focus my time and effort? I actually think what all of these innovations and just how quickly the world is moving towards, it can actually make more meaning in our own personal lives because it almost forces you to be a lot more introspective.
Absolutely. And actually, funnily enough, I've never wrote as much before AI than I do now. Because first of all, with AI, ideation is easier, right? And even just the very process of me ideating, it will overflow into I have to write it down, right? And then now that I found the limitations of AI written writing, I just write more. Plus, funnily enough, because of this whole AI slop phenomenon, which is real, as you said, there is a disgust about it. And I think good writing will be more valuable than ever when everyone is just churning out slop, right? And I think, and we won't get too philosophical. We'll move on to the economy in a second. But I think this whole drama that's unfolding, it doesn't just reveal more about who we are as humans, which is definitely happening because we reflect more on our humanity. It's almost like AI being this mirror that we can look into and see more about ourselves. But I think it also poses an interesting question about what language is or what art is. And let me explain why. Because if you think about language, how it developed and evolved, and the role that it played in human society, and also art, it always actually had a religious connotation in the beginning, and then it became kind of mainstream and spread out, right? But like art started with iconography. Even the ancient Greeks, right? They looked at art and statues as kind of like bringing something from the higher realms of forms into like a lower realm of the tangible, right? Or if you think about it, I think it was Michelangelo who said that, I had to like, chip away at the stone to free the angel from that, piece of marble. Well, it did also suggest that it's almost like transforming something from a higher realm into this lower realm. So there was a religious connotation to it. And language is the same, like even today, we are very, very careful about, the whole conversation on language, how can we use language, how should we use language is a tenuous one. And I can't help but see that on an experiential level, I think we are experiencing almost like AI art and AI written language on some level, on a psychological level, somewhat sacrilegious almost, right? That can be a part of our reaction to it. And I'm talking about, in this case, not the theological religious, but more like, the psychological religious of what kind of role that plays, the distinction between the sacred and the profane. Which is just fascinating to me. And this is something that we couldn't have predicted, or maybe of course, like hindsight 2020, right? But I'm just saying that there are these blockers that just keep appearing, and it will kind of ride the story of AI and what role it will play in human society. Now, on a more professional note on that, so maybe we can spend the final 10-15 minutes that we have on the economy, the question of the economy, because obviously with all this capital that flowed into AI, we all knew, and I said this before, that in the beginning of the year, I think I wrote an article about the AI bubble, and it wasn't like a genius take, the AI bubble is coming. It's obviously, if it's huge, the bigger it is, the more obvious that there will be like a bubble forming just as a market mechanism, right? This whole boom, bust, build cycle, you can go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, and probably even before that when something huge happens, like the steam engine or electricity, the market naturally responds with a boom. So a bunch of capital goes into it, but then imagination runs faster than reality, right? And people need to figure out what they do with this huge new thing. And then that boom will lead to a bust, where a lot of the deadwood will burn off and a lot of the dead ends will get abandoned. And then there's a build cycle where consolidation happens, and then the durable innovation will reveal itself. It happened with the steam engine, electricity, and now the third wave of the Industrial Revolution that we're living through. It's still happening, right? So I think that wasn't a question whether there will be an AI bubble. It's more of a question of how will that look like. Will the pace of progress just kind of outpace it and kind of make the bubble irrelevant in a way? So maybe let's just start with a blunt question. Do you think that we're headed to an AI bubble burst in 2026? And then we can talk about how that might look like.
I don't know if we're headed to a bubble burst in 26. I also, as I look forward, I think this bubble is going to look very different than past ones. I think you had mentioned the Industrial Revolution, some of these past ones that have gone on. Even with like the .com one more recently, those bubbles took a long time from start to finish. It wasn't that they occurred in a few years and it was done. Sometimes it was decades. I think what is once again so different, this time around, is the pace at which, even if there is a bubble, it will be burst very quickly and it will move on, and it will actually provide the catalyst for that next leg up. And I think that's very challenging for, some people to kind of wrap their heads around. A big part of it, though, is you can scale AI massively. And, you never could do that. Like take railroads, for instance. If you really wanted to scale railroads, there are physical physical limitations in terms of capacity. Whereas if I'm trying to copy an image on the internet, there really is no kind of theoretical limit until I get to, energy capacity that's powered in that. So it's very different. It's like the software problem as well. If you're going to create a physical product, if you create 100 and it takes 5 people, you may need 10 people to create 200. With software, it's like once you create it once, it's very, very easy to scale up, and you need, very minimal overhead to go further than that. I think that's what we'll see with just AI and now with generative AI. I also think that that's going to impact, what we actually think about as a bubble. I don't really think it's going to be this huge thing that goes to the moon and then comes crashing back down to Earth and we start over. I actually think that there's going to be a much quicker, probably series of them, but they're going to be a lot smaller than probably what we're used to. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the current market, you see NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA just hit $5 trillion market cap. They're providing like really that physical capacity for all of these other AI companies to function. And obviously the energy sector is a big part of that as well. I mean, that's something you can't print energy. So that's what really makes me think that these are going to be more of like those microcycles that we'll see. And I think they're going to move a lot faster than probably anyone is going to be used to.
And to be fair, if we look at the Industrial Revolution or industrial revolutions, that is true. Like that tendency of the magnitude and the impact, and then the kind of the amplitude of how fast it happens, it's been shrinking since the steam engine, right? So it takes quicker for the capital to move in, for the R&D to ramp up, for the applications to being built, and then the consolidation, and then the repeat of the cycle. So if we compare even just the past 50 years to 250 years ago, we had a bunch of these mini cycles that people just forget because probably they don't even remember it. It wasn't big enough. But even in this third wave of the Industrial Revolution, it happened multiple times, these smaller cycles, right? And there are a few that we still remember, like the dot-com bubble. And then we can say it's not a technology bubble, but let's say even the housing bubble, they were big ones. Now, I also don't hear people really talk about the fact that these bubbles take place in a very different communication landscape. We haven't had a global connected flow of information, almost like uninhibited, right? So that did not take place even in 2008 with the housing bubble. Definitely not at the time of the dot-com bubble. So there, investors and the key stakeholders and the key players did not have access to information. That the average person definitely did not have quick updates on what's actually happening. So it's almost like when you're anticipating these things, it almost makes the thing do not come to pass, or we are just over prepared for it, and thus it does not shake out as we expect. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's like the if a boiling water in a pot, if you're watching it, it's not going to boil, right? But as soon as you go away from it, it will. And I do think that is a very key difference, because even in the dot-com era, you didn't really have the hyper, not just personalized, but hyper time sensitive communication that exists today. Something can go on the other side of the world, and you can know about it in 2 minutes. And I think sometimes we don't take a step back and really think about how profound that is. But I think you're right. What it does is it reduces the amount of information asymmetry that people have. And it really does just democratize what you can actually see. And obviously there's an argument around, well, are you seeing what's actually occurring? That's probably a different segment for a different time. But I think that the general the general truth of all of it is the speed at which you can get information. And so, let's say in times past, if you were receiving the information a year late, that's going to impact you very different than if you receive it 5 minutes from when it happens. And so how I think that applies to, generative AI, and if there is going to be a bubble or not, is I think individuals and even companies are going to be able to pivot much faster if something is not panning out, and they've learned about that from other companies or from social media. I think the flip side of that, though, is the just the overall amount of hype and how fast that moves. You can go on, LinkedIn, any other social media right now, and you almost kind of have the thought process of, wow, I feel like I'm very behind. Everybody is using AI agents. They're so sophisticated. They're getting a ton of use out of it. Maybe I am behind. So there's also that social media element of, people only putting their highlight reels on social media
Yeah,
and
the
kind of,
FOMO, yeah.
hiding all the things that aren't ready for prime time. So I think it's just something to be very, very cognizant of, but it absolutely is going to, impact the market as we go forward.
And then final thought on the economy. I just had, actually it was earlier this week, I had a conversation with Ron Hattrick, who's a labor economist, and he is a vocal AI skeptic, right? So actually a lot of these points that I'm bringing up, we discussed it on the show. And so he makes an interesting case, though, that he says that even if the AI bubble will burst, he believes it will, right? Even then, one of the key differences is that all the previous bubbles always employed a bunch of people, right? So as the capital moves in and the production ramps up, that automatically involved a bunch of people. I think about the railroads, right? And that happened actually in England. It was a huge bust of the railroads, and it's such a fundamental technology, and it still happened, right? Dot-com bubble, I think it employed 40 million people. The housing bubble 7, or maybe it's the other way around. And then when the bubble pops, also those people immediately lose their jobs, which hits the consumer market. And then the trickle effect really results in those devastating consequences. However, with the AI bubble, it hasn't actually employed a bunch of people. In fact, there was a net job loss so far, which is actually not necessarily because AI is taking over jobs. It's probably more like, as we can speculate, that people are letting companies are letting people go. It might be because they're investing in technology or data centers and so forth, and then they need to find the counterbalance on the bottom line. But whatever the reason is, there hasn't been a huge amount of new employment generated by AI. All the new employment took place in healthcare, and the hospitality sector had little to do with AI, if anything. So that if this bubble pops, it might hurt. So there's this huge amount of money that's mainly circulating among these technology companies investing in each other. And even if, let's say, there's a deflation in expectations, something happens, no one will really lose their jobs directly because of that. So it might actually generate a softer landing. So actually, with that, I think this was a great conversation. I really appreciated your insights. And for the final 10 minutes that we have, can you tell us a little bit more about your newsletter? Because I definitely want to share this with people. I do recommend it often, and I send it to people. Like, why did you start writing that newsletter, and what do you usually cover in the series?
Yeah. So I started the AI Edge newsletter 2 months ago. And I really started it because I post pretty frequently on LinkedIn. I post my thoughts, pretty predominantly about AI in general. But I think in some cases, like the real topics that people are interested in or want to talk about, I don't see that as much. So, I'll give an example. The AI safety conversation, that has been one where, it's almost like this bubble of how do we kind of control AI as much as possible, and pretty much only give it to the people who we think are going to be safe with it. And I think I took a very different view on that. But I think it's areas like that where really kind of talking about, in some cases, the things that I wanted to see a conversation around. And what I found is that it really resonates, with the readers and with others that are looking through the various articles and everything in there. And so I think that's what really kind of started me off on that path. I also think too, like I'm not really treating it as something that I have to grow or that I have a certain expectation around. I'm literally doing it because I enjoy it, and it just makes life so much easier, and I have full control over it. So for me, it's about how do I publish one of these, once a week, and how do I find the topics that are meaningful and that people should really be thinking about, in addition to all the things that we usually see in the news or in the companies that we work with.
It helps you yourself to think through these things, definitely. And what makes you excited today about AI? And maybe you can talk about even what you're writing about this second for next week's release.
It's interesting. I'll get back to kind of our initial, at the very beginning of this conversation. I really started off being very skeptical about AI. And I think what I've learned along that journey is it's helped me ask, really those hard hitting questions. But I think at the same time, because I've really dug deep on a lot of these different AI issues, it's made me become just a huge proponent of it and the benefit that it will have for humanity. And I think there's so many areas, I work in healthcare, but I think every industry has just this untapped benefit from applying different forms of AI. And whether it's helping out, in our case, it's our members, and other industries, their customers. I think it really can make our lives a lot more meaningful, a lot easier. And I think it can just make our lives better. So that's really where I see it as we go forward. That's what makes me very excited about it. And, yes, there is that uncertainty. Nobody can predict the future. Nobody knows, truly what the next 5 years will bring. But I'm very optimistic and I'm very hopeful, because technology, at the end of the day, it's not a good or a bad thing. It's really how we as people utilize it. And I think as long as we are being skeptical, as long as we are thinking about societal impact, that will ensure that, we can use it for the benefit of humanity.
Definitely. And look, I always enjoy our conversations, and I appreciate your time today. And, maybe we'll do it in a couple of months again, just reflecting on what happened and what came to pass and what didn't, and, where AI might be in 6 months' time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I also appreciate the conversation, Les, and hopefully in 6 months' time, I don't have to come back and be wrong about the bubble burst. So we'll see.
We'll see. If we are, we'll be honest about it, and we'll wrestle with the questions of the time.